Hello, it's good to see you here. Tonight our pages flip to a specific kind of vampire, a bloated and ugly body raised from the dead of the Slavic peoples, not quite like the charming nobles of modern tales. Together we will understand the world they lived in and how they encountered and dealt with this creature. I would love for you to like and subscribe, but only if you're glad for the perspective you're about to receive from me. And please comment where in the world you're from and what time it is. It's very interesting for everyone to know who's listening in. Find your most comfortable position to rest in as the birds sing to the world, and let's get on to our Slavic folklore story. The air in the Carpathian foothills holds its own kind of weight in winter, thick with the scent of wood smoke and something faintly metallic, as though the cold has sharpened the air until it tastes like iron on the tongue. Snow muffles most sounds, but not the quiet clink of pails at the well or the soft thud of boots tamping down paths between cottages. The village, if you could even call it that, being more a scatter of homes stitched together by frozen lanes, rests under a moon so pale and bloated it makes every rooftop look silvered, every bare tree like a claw frozen mid-swipe. Inside these cottages, warmth clings stubbornly, smelling of damp wool, baked rye bread, and the low, slow stew that has been cooking since morning. People here live in a rhythm dictated by the season, up with the thin light, work until the fingertips ache, then gather in the half-gloom to eat and trade the day's remarks. Most nights end quietly, but some, like this one, are set apart by an undercurrent of conversation that slides between rooms and hearths like a draft that can't be blocked. The talk is of a burial 3 days past, though everyone already knows the details. An older man, no great saint in life but hardly wicked enough to warrant fear and death, laid into the earth with the rites due to him. The priest had done his part, the family theirs. And yet as the evening folds in around them, there's the prickling sensation that something in the order of things has shifted slightly. Not enough to name, but enough to keep doors barred a little earlier. No one makes a formal announcement in these situations. That would make the fear too real. Instead, it slipped into conversation. A dog that won't go near the graveyard, even when called. The faint scuff of footsteps in snow that should have no owner after midnight. A candle guttering out for no reason in a kitchen where the shutters are tight. People pretend and they shrug, but they listen harder. For all their piety, the villagers have long held that the world of the living and the world beyond are not so firmly divided, especially when the ground is frozen and the soul perhaps takes longer to travel wherever it is meant to go. It's why the dead are watched for 3 nights after burial, not out of forgetfulness, but to keep a returning spirit occupied until dawn. This winter has been particularly mean, the kind that makes the idea of a corpse stirring in its coffin not seem far-fetched. Hunger and cold work strange alchemy on the mind. People half expect the unnatural to step out of the tree line if only to break the monotony. And vampires, unlike most spirits in local tales, are not distant, shapeless evils. They are faces people remember. They cross thresholds if you let them. Sometimes they knock first, and sometimes they don't bother. Tonight the snow is falling again, but lightly, in slow spirals, that catch in the fur trim of hats and the lashes of anyone careless enough to look up too long. Across the lanes, light leaks through warped shutters, painting thin amber stripes on the drifts. Inside one such cottage, the forager of the village sits hunched over his meal, with mushrooms he found in a season where there should be none, and he's chewing with the slow deliberation of a man whose mind is turning. He had been near the graveyard earlier, collecting brush for kindling. He will say nothing of the disturbance he noticed in the snow, the faint crescent indentations as if something barefoot and deliberate had passed by, circling around, then vanished into the pines. In the easternmost house, the blacksmith's wife claims she heard a knock just before the church bell marked the hour, 3 times, evenly spaced, on a door she never opened. She sits by the fire now, mending a shirt with thread so red it shines like blood in the low light. Her stitches are neat, but her hand trembles slightly, as if from the cold, but we know it's not that. The village has its defenses, charms above doors, sprigs of dried herbs tucked into eaves, old prayers whispered over the threshold each night, but these are not foolproof. Everyone knows that, and they work all the harder to maintain the illusion that they are. To admit otherwise is to invite a certain kind of despair, the one that lets you hear every creak of the floorboards as a footstep, and every branch scratching the roof as a hand reaching down towards your home. Out by the frozen river, the trees huddle so close their branches interlock, and between them the hills loom, dark against the paler sky. There are stories that say vampires prefer such places, where paths are uncertain and the cold slows even the most determined pursuit. The hills keep their own counsel, and anyone who goes too far into them without cause is generally not missed. The night deepens, and the kind of quiet that follows feels less like peace and more like listening. Somewhere out there, in the white and cold of the dark, something could be moving. Or perhaps it's only their imagination, coaxed into overwork by the season's cold, and the knowledge that the man buried 3 days ago was never one for staying put when he was alive. In this part of the world, the dead are rarely left entirely alone, even after burial. The Slavic people have a complicated relationship with their departed, equal parts reverence and caution with the occasional side-eye of suspicion. A funeral here is not merely a matter of sending someone off with a few words and a handful of soil. It's a carefully treaded ritual to prevent the deceased from changing their mind and coming back. When someone passes, the body is usually kept in the home for a short time, laid out on a table or a bench. Mirrors are covered because the dead, they say, can see themselves in a mirror and remember that they once had a reflection, and that memory might tempt them to linger. Shoes are sometimes removed and hidden because, just like reflections, habits are a fast and easy way to connect a spirit deeper with their old lives. Visitors come to pay respects, bringing bread, salt, or a splash of harilka for the mourners, though a few discreetly tuck cloves of garlic into door frames on their way in. Songs are sung, not always solemn, sometimes a brisk, almost matter-of-fact tune, because grief here is rarely the quiet, still thing outsiders expect. The coffin, often simple pine, is carried out feet first. This is important. Leading with the feet means the dead cannot look back at the house, cannot fix their gaze upon it and remember it fondly enough to return. In some villages they go a step further and knock 3 times on the doorframe as they leave, a final warning to the spirit that this is a one-way journey. At the gravesite the rituals multiply. The priest says his blessings, but the villagers add their own. A scattering of poppy seeds may be thrown into the grave, a gesture born of a belief as odd as it is persistent, that a vampire-to-be will feel compelled to count every seed before rising, thus wasting the entire night. The fact that the seeds blend into the dark earth only improves the trap. Some families slip iron objects into the coffin, a nail, a needle, sometimes a small knife, because iron is thought to bite deeper into whatever unnatural force animates the dead. If the person had been quarrelsome or prone to grudges in life, there are more precautions. Hands are bound with twine, a stone is placed under the chin, and even a net can be laid over the body. The last one is not very strange. After all, nets are tangles of tiny problems, and vampires, according to the lore of seeds, are compulsive problem solvers. They'll sit there picking apart the knots until dawn breaks, robbing them of their chance to roam. Of course, there's the more direct measure, placing a thorn or wooden stake across the chest. Contrary to the stories that traveled west, this is not always driven in immediately. It's more of a just-in-case provision, kept handy for later use. Killing a vampire, if that's even the right word, is no small matter, and you don't go stabbing the recently deceased without cause. All of this is done in the open, with the kind of sober practicality you'd see in people that have done this before. And yet, even as the rituals proceed, there's always the possibility that something was missed. Maybe the wrong prayer was uttered. Maybe the iron wasn't pure enough. Maybe the person had debts or grievances no one knew about, and those are the kind of baggage that keep a spirit restless. After the burial, the family will host a meal called a pominki, where the food is as much for the dead as the living. A portion is set aside, a spoonful of each dish left untouched so the spirit can dine unseen. People say it's to honor them, but privately few admit it's more like a bribe. Eat at the table and you won't go looking for anything warmer than that. The frozen grounds make burials harder, and there are whispers that shallow graves are easier to escape. There's more darkness than daylight, and long shadows have more room to do their work. The smell of freshly turned earth lingers in the air, and in a season where so little changes, that single scent can feel like a loud announcement. The villagers keep the church candles burning long after a recent death. Children are told not to wander near the cemetery wall, not because of wolves, but because a vampire is far more likely to notice a child. and far less likely to be discouraged from interacting. These customs, for all their variety, form a kind of invisible fence, and everyone understands the basic rules. You keep that fence in good repair, even if you're not sure whether things are out there. It always begins small, like a hairline crack in a cup that no one notices until it starts leaking. The signs that the grave has failed to hold its body are rarely cinematic. No winged silhouette dances across the moon, and there's no dramatic shriek from the church tower. Instead, it's the sort of evidence you can almost talk yourself out of, until it stacks up too high to ignore. A cousin, for instance, who swears they saw the recently buried man walking the lane at dusk, his gait exactly the same as in life, but with a stiffness as though each step had to be remembered before it could be made. Or a cow that refuses to give milk, its eyes rolling towards the tree line with a wide, glassy fear. In the next village over, there's talk of a child fevered for days, muttering the name of a dead uncle in her sleep. Then there's the thing about the graves themselves. Snow has its own way of recording movement, little indentations, the way drifts crumble at the edges. Sometimes villagers find the soil over a grave sunken strangely, as if something beneath had shifted its position. Or they find the opposite, earth pressed upward, a mound slightly higher than it was before. A quiet suggestion that the coffin inside is no longer lying flush. People will make excuses at first. Perhaps there are foxes now, or the frost is heaving the ground, or the imagination is simply playing tricks because the nights are long and the mind is restless. But they keep their excuses quiet, and they keep their eyes sharp nonetheless. The more superstitious will start paying attention to patterns in illness. Vampires in Slavic origin are not always about to kill. Sometimes they draw life away slowly, a quiet theft measured in weeks. People will grow pale, complain of a weight in their chest, or begin to sleep too much, waking no more rested than before. The difference between winter fatigue and supernatural predation is a subtle one, but in villages where life itself is a kind of ongoing endurance, people learn to notice the difference. Then there are the dreams. It's said that if a vampire has visited you, you will dream of it, not as a beast, but as the person you knew. They might sit at the foot of your bed, speaking to you in tones of voice both familiar and off, or they might simply watch you, unmoving, until you wake. Such dreams leave a heaviness in the limbs, and more than one villager has woken with the distinct impression that their blanket is shifted differently. Quieter still are the household disturbances, a loaf of bread going stale in a single night despite being baked fresh that morning, water in the bucket at the well tasting faintly of rust, candles that burn unevenly, one side of the wick collapsing into a dark curl. These are small heralds of a larger problem, and the old women, stirring their pots, notice them before anyone else dares to speak of them. Occasionally someone insists on proof, tangible proof, before agreeing that the dead may have broken up into the world. This proof usually takes the form of digging. In some places this is done under the guidance of a priest. In others it's a quiet affair held at night by those who trust their own judgment over holy sanction. What they look for is telling, a corpse too fresh, the skin a ruddy red rather than pale, with lips damp and faintly darkened as if stained by wine. Sometimes the fingernails seem longer, though those who know the truth about post-mortem changes will mutter about how length is just an illusion. And yet illusions have a way of becoming real when it's fear doing the measuring. The moment the pattern is recognized, the village changes its breathing, and the air itself seems to shift. Conversations are cut short when strangers draw near. The space between evening chores and full darkness narrows as people hurry home earlier. The sound of shutters being latched becomes a kind of chorus. And in every house the small measures of safety multiply. Garlic braids are rehung where they had sagged. A prayer is scratched into the lintel with a bit of chalk. Salt is poured in a thin line along the windowsill. What's curious is how quickly everyone goes back to routine once the measures are in place. People go back to mending harness straps or shelling beans by the fire. Children are still sent to fetch water, though perhaps in pairs now. Life doesn't stop entirely for the suspicion of a vampire. It simply tilts to accommodate it. The signs themselves are never enough for certainty. There will always be those who say it's all weather and nerves, that vampires are just a way to give shape to the nameless wrong things that happen in winter, and the things people feel in the cold. And they may be right, but sometimes the wind will shift and bring with it a faint scent from the graveyard, and everyone will remember why those measures happened in the first place. When encountering a Slavic vampire, it often fails to match the storybook terror that's popular in the West. There is of course fear, but it's a dense, slow-moving kind, the sort that settles in the stomach heavily rather than exploding into a fight-or-flight panic. The Slavic vampire is not always a gaunt predator draped in theatrical cloaks and menacing looks. Sometimes it is simply a close memory of the person it once was. In those rare cases where the encounter happens, it might begin without a single sound. Perhaps you notice the absence first. No crunch of snow under the steps of the person, no mist of breath in the cold air. They may move with a peculiar deliberation, as if each gesture and move was rehearsed. Their eyes, when they find yours, might carry the exact shade of color you remember, but it doesn't seem as if they're really looking at you. Some are dressed exactly as they were buried, earth still clinging to the hems and cuffs, and their fabric is damp and stiff in the cold. Others will appear strangely as if their burial clothes were altered, buttons undone, sleeves rolled, as though they've made small adjustments to comfort themselves for the walk. This unsettles people even more than the pallor of their skin or the unnatural steps. A monster in a shroud is one thing. Monster fussing with its collar is another thing entirely. There's often a faint scent that travels with them, hard to place but unmistakable once it's noticed. A mixture of damp soil, iron, and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. It catches in the back of your throat, making you swallow without meaning to. Dogs recognize it instantly. They often growl low, but will back away with their tails tucked. When the vampire speaks, if it chooses to, it tends to be in the voice remembered, but slowed, with the rhythm flattened into something less human. They may greet you by name, they may ask for small, almost absurd things. A cup of water, news of the harvest. In folklore, this serves a purpose. An invitation, whether literal through the doorstep or symbolic into conversation, re-establishes the bond that death was meant to cut. Accepting this bond is dangerous. It's said that to share food or drink with one is to open the door for them, no matter how many locks you may put on that door. Some encounters are briefer, a shade glimpsed at the tree line, pale in the moonlight with its head tilted at an odd angle, or the sight of someone you know should be buried, walking the opposite side of the frozen river, matching your pace but never closing the distance. You might tell yourself it was a trick of light or exhaustion, until you remember that no tracks followed them in the snow behind them. The most unnerving ones are the ones that take place indoors. These are rare, but they can happen, usually in homes where the burial customs were not strictly followed. The vampire can appear at the threshold, but in these tales it's already crossed it. People find it sitting at the kitchen table, fingers resting lightly on the wood as though waiting for a cup of tea. The fire burns lower in its presence, the shadows and the light sharpening in the corners. The folklore insists that such moments have rules. A vampire cannot cross certain protections, cannot stand the sight of holy symbols, cannot withstand the recitation of specific prayers. But the older stories make it clear that these rules bend. A crucifix is only a barrier if the one holding it believes without doubt. Garlic works best when replaced often. Stale cloves have no power. As for thresholds, well, sometimes the invitation was made long before. There's an element of the uncanny in the way a vampire moves when it's close. Quickness is rare. Instead, the hypnotic steadiness of each motion is maintained, a measured approach. If they reach for you, it's not with a lunge, but with a slow inevitability, as though they have all the time in the world. Witnesses often remember their own silence more than anything the vampire did. The mind stumbles over whether to treat this figure as the kin returning, or an unfamiliar enemy, and the hesitation is the space in which this creature thrives. This is not a frenzied predator. It's something that waits and drains you slowly, confident that the living will break the tension first. And when the moment passes, when the vampire turns away into the darkness, or is driven back towards its grave, it leaves behind a quiet more oppressive than any noise could have been. The night seems colder, and the air feels thinner, and catches in your throat as if you're unable to breathe. You may not speak of it to anyone. Some keep the memory private for years, not out of disbelief, but because the telling risks making it real again. The next day you might notice the snow outside your door has been disturbed in a perfect semicircle, as though something stood there a long while before deciding to knock. By the time the signs have settled into a collective understanding, the small disturbances and lingering illnesses forming a clear picture of what's going on, there's an unspoken plan forming already. No one calls it a plan. That would make it official, and official things carry consequences. Instead, it builds in fragments, carried along in errands and short quips in neighborly visits, hidden under the hum of ordinary life. In the morning, the blacksmith's boy is sent to fetch more iron nails than the week's work requires. He says nothing of their purpose, but when he lays them on the workbench, his father tests each one for straightness with a look in his eyes that says it's not quite about the carpentry or the metalwork. Over in the weaver's cottage, a length of linen is cut into strips, thin and strong, with no explanation given for what. A shepherd's daughter gathers dried hawthorn branches from behind the barn, muttering something about mending the fence, though everyone knows no sheep have been kept in that pasture for years. Gossip becomes less idle and more strategic. Over the low hiss of the samovar, women trade recipes and quietly compare whose households have felt the most fatigue. An aunt from the next hamlet over claims her cousin once cured such a case by leaving a broom upside down behind the front door, the bristles towards the lintel. The broom, she says, forces the vampire to count every stalk before entering. A simple trap, though one best kept to yourself. Men speak in half phrases as they work, one splitting logs while another sharpens an axe. No one ever says steak out loud, but they all think it. Even the priest, who technically should discourage such unholy preparations, keeps his rebukes soft and vague. The church may offer holy water, but it is the villagers who will be left holding the tools when the moment comes. The geography of the village begins to shift in small ways. Paths are swept not for neatness, but to record footprints. A jug of water is set by the window so any disturbance in its surface can be noticed in the morning. Doors that used to creak are quietly oiled. A vampire might be slowed by a latch, but it's better to know when it's moving through your world than be startled by its sudden presence. These measures aren't purely defensive, they're also psychological. Doing anything, even symbolic, feels better than waiting. Waiting invites dread, and dread eats at the mind faster than hunger at the belly. This is why preparations are done with an almost casual air, folded neatly into the day's work. The act of hanging garlic beside the doorframe becomes no different than hanging a bundle of onions in the pantry. Of course, there is an awkwardness in the fact that some of the village are not convinced at all. They watch these quiet arrangements with polite skepticism, their faith placed in the idea that the dead stay buried unless disturbed by the living. Still, they rarely interfere. Superstition might be folly to them, but it's harmless until someone takes a shovel to the cemetery at midnight. And yet shovels are being ready. The question is never if in the minds of these villagers, but when. Waiting too long risks more illness and more signs that might pile up. Acting too soon risks the shame of desecrating the grave of someone who might be resting peacefully after all. The balance is delicate, and the decision-making process resembles two animals caught in a fight, not knowing which one will make the first move. The weather complicates things further. The winter has brought snow that falls thick enough to change the shape of the land overnight. Each morning the world has to be relearned. New drifts, new shadows, and old paths hidden until the boot finds them again. It makes the thought of a nighttime gathering in the graveyard all the more uncomfortable. Still, some households have started keeping lanterns topped with oil, and certain individuals are more mindful of where their spades and mattocks have been left. Among the younger folks, there's a nervous energy that manifests in their restless work, splitting extra kindling, repairing shutters, and making excuses to pass by the suspected grave. They'll glance without seeming to, studying the mound for changes. In the tavern corner, a few exchange whispered boasts about how they'd handle it, though their tone is the brittle kind that comes from knowing that they might be called upon to prove it. The older generation, though, keeps their preparations quiet. They've seen enough winters to know that fear swells in telling things, and that the less is said aloud, the fewer witness your worry. So they knot their garlic braids, test the heft of their hammers, and in some cases pay a discreet visit to the hedge which, at the edge of the woods. She has her own supplies, powders, charms, and one or two items that smell sharply of resin and smoke, By the time the first truly windless night arrives, it comes with a stillness so complete the sound of a dropped pin could carry from one end of the village to the other. No one calls a meeting, and there's no council. The preparations are in place, and there's a quiet certainty stitched between households that if the grave is to be opened, it needs to be on this night, and that when it happens, everyone who matters will know their part already. When the moment in the night comes, it rarely unfolds with the kind of ceremony that songs and stories later pretend it had. Confronting a vampire is not an epic quest. It is more often an act like grim housework, the sort of thing best done before breakfast but after you've had enough tea and water to steady your hands. And like all necessary chores, everyone has their own opinion on how it should be done, none of which quite match. Some insist that you go at night, when the creature is likely to be in its resting place. Others argue for dawn, when the sun offers at least symbolic aid. The argument never resolves neatly, so the chosen hour tends to be dictated by weather, the general mood, and how quickly courage holds before it curdles into hesitation. The preparations for the act itself are a patchwork of inherited wisdom and whatever happens to be on hand. Hawthorn stakes are preferred, carved to a point and smoothed so they won't splinter, but if hawthorn can't be found, ash or oak will do. In some cases, a sharpened spade handle is pressed into service. Holy water, if available, is carried in small bottles that clink softly in coat pockets. Salt is divided into little pouches, tied tight and kept close enough to throw in a pinch if things go wrong. And of course there are local flourishes, the things no one outside a handful of valleys would have ever heard of. In one hamlet they swear by a strip of linen soaked in vinegar and wrapped around the right wrist, claiming it confuses the vampire's senses. In another the men carry a live rooster to the graveyard, believing its crow could weaken the revenant. The logic of these rituals is rarely explained, and asking too many questions tends to get you a weird look. When the party sets out, the air feels different. Even if the wind is still, there is a pressure in the lungs, a heaviness to each breath. Lanterns sway as they walk, their light catching the edges of frost and dancing like the twinkle of stars in the sky. The snow crunches underfoot in a rhythm that feels too loud in the quiet. Conversation is minimal. Instructions when given are short and practical. Watch your footing, hold the light higher, make sure you brought the right tools. Upon reaching the grave, the ritual begins in earnest. If the priest is present, he mutters the necessary prayers, his breath clouding in the cold. If no priest is willing or able to attend, the eldest in the group may speak the words instead, stitched together from memory and local habits. Someone will probably trace a cross in the air, someone else will throw a line of salt across the mound. The soil is turned in slow, deliberate shovelfuls. The sound is dull, and the smell of cold, damp earth rises around them. If the ground is frozen hard, they work in shifts, leaning on tools until the frost reluctantly yields. Sometimes halfway through, someone will murmur that they should stop, that disturbing the dead is worse than leaving them be even when they walk. But the murmur never takes root, because by then the task has momentum, and no one wants to be the one who actually breaks it. When the coffin is finally revealed, there is a moment where everyone simply stands and looks. The wood may be damp and darkened, swollen slightly at the seams. Occasionally a faint sound is heard, though whether it's the creak of shifting wood or something else entirely is a matter for each listener's conscience. The lid is pried open slowly, with a care that seems at odds with the purpose of the gathering. Inside, the vampire rarely looks like the corpse people expect. In some cases, the face is fuller than it had been in life. The lips are dark as expected and slightly parted, as though about to speak. There may be a faint flush in the cheeks and subtle moisture on the teeth. The nails are long, and the hair is perhaps a touch thicker than memory usually would have said. All of this would be unsettling enough, but what strikes most is the stillness. It's a wrong kind of stillness, not like that of a body at rest. It's a stillness as though it's holding itself in place to be hidden. This is the moment when the ritual proper takes place. The stake is positioned over the heart, and the tool is gripped firmly. No speeches are made. There is simply a sharp, decisive motion, a sound like wood splitting, and then the weight of the thing in the coffin seems to shift, as if tension had bled out of it all at once. Some people follow this with a scattering of poppy seeds or a handful of earth from a crossroads. Others turn the body onto its stomach so that, should it rise, it will begin digging downwards instead of up. When the task is done, the coffin is closed again, and the grave is refilled. Some smooth the earth back into place with an almost tender neatness, as though tidying a bed for someone to sleep well. Others leave it rough, a visual reminder that this is no ordinary resting place. The group disperses quickly, each taking a different path home. And though the village will not speak of it openly, there is a subtle shift in the air afterwards, as if the weight that had been pressing down on the village loosened its grip slightly. Doors open a little later the next morning, and shutters creak wider, and the work of living resumes, threaded with the quiet knowledge that the worst should be over. The morning after the last blow had been struck and the ritual was completed, the village exhales, not in triumph, but in the strange relief of having closed a task no one wanted to start. The air feels fractionally lighter, as though the frost on the eaves has loosened, but the work is not done. The act of confronting the vampire is only the first part of the process. What comes next is a different kind of labor, one aimed at reweaving the frayed edges of the village. First comes the cleansing of the grave. This is less about tidying up, really, than it is about making certain no lingering trace invites return. Fresh earth is shoveled until the mound is flush with the ground, then tamped down with boots so no pockets of air remain. If poppy seeds or salt were not used during the confrontation, they are sprinkled now. In some regions, the soil is mixed with ashes from the hearth of the vampire's former home, a symbolic reminder that the fire of life had been extinguished. The tools require much attention. Stakes are burned entirely or hidden far from the home, never reused for another task. Shovels and axes are washed with well water, and sometimes pass through a flame to kill any residue. This is not simply superstition. A tool that has touched the undead is thought to remember it, and no one wants that memory in ordinary work. Then comes the purification of the village itself. Some households hang fresh garlands of garlic and wormwood over their doors, not because they expect the vampire to have made it through the night, but because the rituals gain their power from repetition. Holy water is splashed on lintels, and door hinges are oiled while prayers are murmured under breath. The church bell may be rung, not for mass, but to mark the return of order. Food plays a role, as it always does in Slavic life. A communal meal is often shared in the days following, less of a celebration and more a quiet reaffirmation. Bread is baked in larger loaves, stew pots are kept simmering longer than usual, and everyone eats, even those who claim to have no appetite. It is an unspoken decision that shows life continues and the hearths are still warm. The more devout might fast for a day, visiting the church to light candles for the soul of the one who had to be put down. For all the precautions and hard practicality, there is still pity. Pity for the fact that the person in some form had wandered back into the world of the living only to be rejected by it. Such gestures are as much for the living as for the dead. They salve the conscience, smoothing over the harshness of what had to be done. There is also a kind of informal inspection that takes place. Neighbors drop by under the pretense of returning borrowed tools or checking on the health of a relative, their eyes quietly taking in the state of each household. Do the children look better? Is the milk flowing from the cows again? Does the family of the deceased seem less drawn? Their observations are traded later in whispers, a way of confirming to each other whether the sickness of the village has been truly lifted. For the next few nights, more lamps burn in windows than usual. The light is a reassurance itself, but also a signal. We are still awake, and we are still watching. Eventually, this pattern does relax. Children resume playing in the lanes after dusk. The dogs stop pacing in circles, and the sound of shutters latching no longer echoes like an alarm. Still, not everything returns to what it was. A house that has hosted a vampire's visit may sit empty for a season, the family moving in with relatives or taking in extra work to afford a new home. The grave itself might be avoided, grass allowed to grow high around it, as though to hide the memory from the casual passerby. The tools used, even when purified, may never quite feel ordinary again. An axe that once split a coffin lid carries a new weight. There is no public acknowledgement and no declaration in the square about the danger having passed. Slavic villages do not tend to write these events down. They live on in hushed whispers told over tea time. What matters is that life moves forward. cautiously, but forward all the same. And yet, even with the finality of the act, there's an understanding that the victory is not necessarily permanent. Vampires are a part of the landscape in these villages as much as the forests, the frost, and the rivers that ice over each year. One has been dealt with, but the possibility of another remains, lurking in the seams between seasons. That awareness lingers quietly and constantly, in the way people glance towards the graveyard when passing at night. So the village settles again, and the snow will melt when the thaw will come, and the earth will loosen, but people's eyes will stay sharp. And somewhere beneath the earth lies a coffin whose occupant is expected to stay put. But time smooths the sharp edges of the event, though it never erases them entirely. In the weeks after, the memory of the vampire lingers in the village like the last smoke from a doused fire. Thin and curling, easy to swipe away until the wind shifts and it catches in your nose. People return to their work, but they carry the memory with them in small, practical ways, tucking it into the fabric of daily life where it can be preserved and forgotten at the same time. Some stories begin to take shape, though their tone shifts depending on who tells them. Around the hearths in the colder evenings, the younger men may recount the confrontation with much more drama than it held, their voices lowered for suspense, a pause before describing the first sight of the coffin lid. In these versions, the vampire always seems a little more fearsome, the night a little heavier, and the courage a little greater. No one interrupts to correct them. The embellishment is part of the process of healing, ensuring that the story can be told without bringing the weight back onto the villagers' shoulders. Among the older folk, the telling is quieter and more deliberate. Details are preserved for instruction, which herbs held their scent for the longest, how deep the frost had gone into the soil, and how quickly the pain and pressure of the village lifted afterwards. Their stories are ironically less about the actual monster and more about the process of survival, and how to do it again much more efficiently. Seasonal customs absorb fragments of the memory. The year after the encounter, more households leave small offerings on their windowsills in late autumn, a silent bribe to any wandering spirit that might be looking for a way in. Pleating garlic into braids was once a chore relegated to the women in midsummer, but it's now a communal task, with extra braids hung not just by the doors but along the fences and barn walls. These habits stay even when the original reason fades into a blur. The grave itself becomes a landmark of a sort, not openly discussed but noted in passing every time. Children dare each other to touch its mound in daylight, then sprint away laughing, though the laughter always has an edge to it. Shepherds, when grazing their flocks nearby, might shift the path of the flock to give the spot a wide berth. Come spring, the grass over it will grow unevenly, a pale patch amid the deeper green, and no one will quite agree on whether it's because of the winter's disturbance or something less natural. The name of the person at the center of it all is used less and less over time, replaced with a vague him or her, as though speaking the name might clearly remind the soul how to find its way back. In the broader region, the event might be folded into the long chain of other stories. Wolves in the lean years, barns struck by lightning, or floods in the spring, until it's just another bead on the cord of the village's history. But memory has a way of coming alive when conditions feel familiar. Years later, if the frost is just as deep, and another burial takes place under the heavy sky, someone might glance towards the cemetery wall a little too long, and a neighbor would suggest adding an extra measure to the funeral rites, just in case. The past will breathe quietly into the present, reminding everyone that what happened once might happen again. And so the vampire lives on, not in the coffin beneath the earth or walking above it, but in the boundaries it drew around the living, boundaries marked by charms over doorways, paths taken in daylight only, and the way people look at a pale face a moment too long before deciding it must be the cold or hunger. The creature itself has been ended, but its shadow is stitched into the culture of the village. In the end, the village moves forward with a kind of pragmatic memory, not dwelling on the vampire but never entirely forgetting it. It becomes a part of the weave, the way a darker thread shows in the cloth when the light catches it. It's subtle, but it's impossible to remove without unmaking and defraying the whole. Now, dear listener, do not fear the cold and dark, for we have taught you a way to keep yourself warm and safe amidst it. If you followed this whole tale, your continued attention is greatly appreciated. It will be treated with another story on the Slavic burial traditions for their dead. The room is warm, though the heat feels oddly suspended in the air, as if even the fire in the clay stove is keeping respectful distance. The smell here is a layered one: beeswax from the candles, the sharp sweetness of dried herbs tucked into corners, and the faint earthy undertone of wool that has been dried too many times by the hearth. Outside, snow falls in its slow, muffled way, but inside the air is thick with a sort of stillness that is not entirely silence. The deceased lies on a sturdy wooden bench, wrapped in a linen sheet that has been washed and whitened with ash, because purity, in the Slavic sense, is not just about looking clean, but about sending the soul into the next world without earthly stains. This washing is as much for the spirit as the body. It is thought that a soul, weighed down by the grime of life, might wander more slowly, or even lose its way. The linen itself is not an arbitrary choice. Flax was considered a plant of transition, growing between earth and sky, its fibers thought to bridge the living world and the afterlife. Around the body, relatives move with a kind of measured slowness. There is no rushing in these final hours. Mirrors are covered with embroidered cloths, not only as a gesture of mourning, but because it's believed a soul might see its reflection and linger, confused about whether it is truly gone. Water basins are tipped out and refilled fresh. Stagnant water could act like a trap, catching a fragment of the departing spirit and holding it in the home. Someone has placed coins, 2 of them, sometimes 3, at the side of the head, though never in the mouth. The origin of this practice is tangled, part old trade metaphor, part instinct. Just as one might need payment to cross a river in life, so might the soul need an offering to pass through the waters that separate the living from the dead. And if the soul doesn't need them, well, the gesture will perhaps provide goodwill from any spirits met along the way. In the corner, an elder hums under her breath, shaping a melody so old it has no remembered beginning. These are plak, mourning songs, meant to soothe the spirit and remind it of the way forward. They are not only laments but gentle maps, naming the relatives who have gone ahead, naming the places that the soul must pass. The belief here is simple. In death, no one likes to be sent off without directions, as in travel. Visitors arrive in small groups, their boots stamping snow from the threshold, their breath clouding briefly before being absorbed into the warm air. They pause before the body, crossing themselves, bowing their heads, sometimes murmuring a few private words. Gifts are left: bread, salt, sometimes a small length of thread or ribbon. Bread is a promise of sustenance, and salt is a guard against corruption, while thread is a tether to keep the soul from being lost entirely. Even in grief, there is some practicality to the proceedings. Someone checks the bindings on the shroud, ensuring they are firm but not knotted. Knots, it is said, might tie the soul to the body, making its release slower. Shoes are absent, the dead are sent barefoot so that their journey is deliberate, and each step is chosen lightly. This comes from the old idea that if a soul could run too quickly, it might return. The fire in the stove is kept lit constantly, and it is tended with more care than usual. Fire is a warding element, its light discouraging wandering spirits. If the flame dies unexpectedly, it is taken as a bad omen, and someone will immediately strike it alight again, muttering a blessing as they do so. For the family, these final hours are about balancing 2 impulses: to honor and hold close the memory of the departed, and to ensure that their spirit is guided firmly onwards. In the old belief, a soul that lingers too long might become restless, eventually turning harmful, not out of malice, but because it is caught between states, seeking warmth and company that it can no longer have. These customs are the scaffoldings that keep the living safe and in place, and the dead at peace. The snow outside thickens, and the candle's glow grows richer against the walls. Every so often, someone will brush a hand along the shroud, a gesture that is equal parts farewell and encouragement. In this way, the room becomes less a place of endings and more a threshold of beginnings. The task of dressing the dead falls to careful hands, and in most households it is the work of those who knew the person well. There's a dignity in it, a sense that the journey ahead deserves a certain formality, even if no human eyes will see what the dead wear beyond the grave. Clothing the departed is not just about propriety, it is an act of sending them off armed with symbols and safeguards. The shroud is always the foundation, traditionally linen. It wraps the body like a second skin, smooth and seamless. Linen is not only durable, it is believed to confuse malevolent forces by binding the body in something that carries no trace of wealth or vanity. Everyone, regardless of status, becomes equal in linen. For men, a clean shirt and trousers might be placed beneath the shroud, sometimes even a belt, because in the old view this was a marker of vitality and control over one's own strength. Sending a man into the next life belted meant sending him with his vigor intact. Women might be dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, hair covered with a scarf. Covering the head shielded the soul from being tugged through the crown by restless spirits. Shoes are a subject of some disagreement. In many regions, as mentioned, the dead are buried barefoot. In others, soft shoes or boots are given, sometimes turned backwards, so that their steps in the other world will be sure, but any attempt to retrace them will lead away from the living. The choice often depended on the family's relationship with the deceased. Those beloved deeply might be given footwear to ease their travel, while those feared or misunderstood are sent barefoot so their path is slowed. Personal items are sometimes added, though not out of sentiment alone. A favorite pipe might be tucked alongside a man's hand, or a spindle laid beside a woman's. These tools are familiar to the soul, but there's also a belief that if the dead are busy, they have less reason to wander. A pipe to tamp, a thread to spin. Color too carries meaning. Most burial clothes are white, the color of purity and light, for a clean passage into the next world. In some places red is used, especially in cases of untimely death. This is because red was thought to repel evil and protect the soul from being waylaid by forces that notice this death. It is a reminder to any force that might cross their path that this one is defended. Adornments are rare, but when they appear, they carry weight. A cross around the neck is obvious, but there are subtler tokens. A sprig of basil or wormwood stitched into the hem of the shirt. Both herbs are believed to repel spirits. Wormwood's bitterness was thought to offend the dead who walk wrongly, and basil's scent is a signal to benevolent forces to guide the traveler. One of the more curious customs is the inclusion of a towel or length of cloth, folded and placed in the coffin. On the surface it might seem practical, something to wipe the brow on a long journey, but its meaning is tied to the crossing between worlds. Towels were offerings, a form of payment or gift to the guardians at the threshold. Even the direction in which the clothing is put on matters. The right sleeve first, the right shoe first, because the right side, in old belief, belonged to the realm of order and life, while the left was tied to chaos and misfortune. To dress the dead beginning with the left would be to invite a crooked path. By the time the clothing is arranged and the shroud is tied, again, never knotted, the figure on the bench no longer looks like someone asleep. They look ready for something else, something more permanent than rest. The garments are plain and the gestures are small, but every choice has been a decision. Once the dead are dressed, the focus shifts to the moment of leaving the house, a moment treated with as much care as the burial itself. In Slavic tradition, it is the soul's first steps towards the other world, and the house must be prepared so the way forward is clear and the path back less inviting. The front door is rarely the way out. In many villages, the body leaves through a side door or even a window, especially if the death was sudden. The reasoning is that by changing the route, you confuse the spirit, making it harder for them to retrace their way back. Spirits, it was said, are creatures of habit. Before this, the room itself is attended to. The floor is swept, but the sweepings are carried far from the home rather than tossed outside the door. To leave them close by would be to give the spirit a path, each bit of dust like a breadcrumb. The windows are sometimes cracked open, even in winter, so the soul can take an easier breath before beginning the journey. A small bowl of water may be set near the head. not for washing, but as a parting refreshment. A sip to a spirit was thought to steady it before they crossed into unknown terrain. One of the more deliberate acts is the stopping of clocks. Every timepiece in the home is paused at the moment of death, its pendulum stilled or its hands set aside. The reasoning here is layered. It marks the end of the person's earthly time, but also prevents the soul from becoming tangled in the rhythms of the living world. A spirit bound to the house's clock might drift in endless repetition. Before the body is moved, prayers are spoken, not just the ones from the church, but older phrases passed through the generations, half blessing and half reminder. These are spoken firmly, the way one might speak to a loved one reluctant to set out on a long trip, with affection, but no room for negotiation. In some households, the elder woman will circle the body 3 times, murmuring protective words in each turn. This is not an arbitrary number, it is the number of completeness, a balance between beginnings and endings. Iron objects are often placed discreetly near the coffin, an axe at the threshold, a knife under the bench. Iron in old Slavic thought was the enemy of unclean forces, not because of its sharpness, but because it was born of fire and stone, elements that purify. Even if the spirit is well-meaning, these charms stand as a guard against anything that might be drawn during the transition. When the bearers lift the coffin, they do so with the feet first. This isn't just tradition, it's strategy. If the dead leave looking back into the house, their gaze might linger, and with it their attachment. Leading with the feet sends a clear signal. The way forward is away. Sometimes the coffin will gently tap the doorframe on the way out, as a symbolic goodbye to the home itself. The path from bench to door is often sprinkled with grains, rye, oats, or wheat, because the soul, like the supernatural beings in many Slavic tales, might be compelled to count them. This is a kindness as much as it is a safeguard. It keeps the spirit's attention focused on something simple and steady until they've crossed completely. Once the coffin has left the house, the doorway is swept again, and the broom's bristles are held upward for a moment before it's put away. This is to block the path back, to tell any lingering presence that the house is now closed to them. The cold outside feels sharper after the still air indoors. Breath clouds around the bearers as they step onto the snow-packed path, their boots crunching in unison. Behind them, the house stands a little different. Not empty, but lighter, as though some tension in its beams has been eased. Those left inside begin quietly uncovering mirrors, rewinding their clocks, and setting water to boil. Life resumes, but in measured steps, for the soul is still on its way. The procession moves at a deliberate pace, not because the road is treacherous, though in winter it often is, but because in Slavic burial tradition, speed is an insult to the dead. A hurried farewell was thought to confuse the soul, making it believe it was being chased out. The road to the cemetery is not merely a route, it is a symbolic corridor between realms. Snow underfoot has its own voice here, the soft crunching of boots in rhythm with the muffled thud of the coffin's weight, shifting in the bearer's hands. The air smells faintly of smoke carried from the village chimneys, mixing with the sharp cold that catches in the chest. Breath rises in clouds from both mourners and the horse pulling the small cart that sometimes carries the body when the distance is long. Even the horses seem to sense the importance of the work, their usual flickering and impatience subdued to a steady gait. The order of the procession follows unwritten rules. At the front walks someone carrying a wooden cross, not only as a Christian symbol, but as a marker of the soul's passage. In older belief, it also acted as a signpost to wandering spirits. Behind the cross comes the coffin, lifted by kinsmen or close friends, always an even number of bearers to keep balance in life and death. The rest follow in quiet pairs, the closest relatives walking directly behind, their faces half hidden by scarves against the cold. In some villages, a small group of singers travels at the rear, their voices weaving through old funeral songs, the kind that mix mourning with instruction. The words often speak of rivers to be crossed, fields to be passed through, and ancestors waiting at the gate. The idea is not only to comfort the living, but guide the dead, remind them of the route beyond this one. These melodies have a cadence like walking. It's steady and repetitive, meant to carry the soul along in step. The route itself is chosen with care. It may wind through the center of the village so that every house can bear witness, for it's considered important that the whole community acknowledges this departure. A soul unrecognized might wander, unsure of its welcome in the next world. In other places, the path avoids certain landmarks entirely, such as wells or mills, because these are liminal spaces where the dead might pause, and pausing can lead to lingering. Crossroads especially were seen as dangerous, where pathways tangled and a spirit could lose its way entirely. At certain points along the road, small gestures are made almost without thinking. A handful of grain might be dropped discreetly by a mourner. Feeding the birds on the way was believed to earn their goodwill, and in Slavic lore, birds often carry messages between worlds. A pinch of salt may be cast into the snow, a silent wish for protection. In winter, when daylight is thin, someone might carry a lantern even in the afternoon. If the procession passes a home where another death has occurred in living memory, it's common for someone from that household to step outside, bow, and cross themselves. This is a reassurance of acknowledging the new traveler, so that in the other realm their own departed might greet them. The children of the village, when they watch from doorways or peek through fences, are hushed by parents out of respect. Even at a distance, they're told not to point at the coffin, for pointing was believed to tether the soul to the one who gestured. The warning runs deep. What you tie with your finger, you may have to untie with your life. As the cemetery gate comes into view, there's often a change in the air, less from the wind than from the shared knowledge that the threshold is near. Conversations, if there were any, quiet completely. The cross-bearer straightens their back, and the singers draw out their last notes so that the melody seems to land directly at the grave. For a moment, the whole procession feels like it's bound by a common step and purpose. The final step is slowest of all. The coffin has been carried the whole way, so the bearers swap positions more frequently, both to rest their arms, and because it's considered unlucky for the same person to carry the dead from house to grave without pause. It's too much of a link, of a thread. If the journey was by cart, it is here that the coffin is lifted down and carried the last steps by hand. The meaning being that the last part of the journey should be on the shoulders of kins or friend, so that the soul feels the weight of love as much as the weight of leaving. By the time the procession reaches the grave's edge, the snow has been pressed into a narrow path by dozens of boots, a white road framed by the darker soil ahead. The sound of the village fades behind, replaced by the small, careful movements of people arranging themselves for what comes next. The cemetery is quiet in a way that is different from the village quiet, less the hush of waiting for something to happen, more the slow, constant settling of what has already happened. The air smells of cold soil, evergreen boughs, and candle wax that has hardened and cracked from older visits. The grave has been dug earlier in the day, its sides neat and vertical, the earth piled in a mound that seems darker than anything else in the winter landscape. The coffin is set down beside the open ground, resting on boards laid across the rim. There's a pause, a moment when no one moves, as if the grave itself is listening. The priest steps forward to say the formal prayers, his breath fogging in front of him. Yet even before the church's rites came to the villages, there were other customs, older and less bound to written words. A handful of earth is taken by the closest kin and dropped onto the coffin's lid before it's lowered. This is meant to signal to the soul that the separation is complete. The living have returned a piece of the earth it came from, and with it the right to rest. In some regions, 3 handfuls are used, each for a different blessing: peace, protection, and safe passage. The number 3 is tied to completeness, after all. Seeds are sometimes scattered into the grave, often poppy or millet. The origin of this practice is 2 points. On one hand, seeds symbolize life continuing, a reminder that death is part of the same cycle that brings life. On the other belief, a restless soul would be compelled to count, fact that poppy seeds are small, dark, and nearly impossible to find in loose soil only strengthens their use as a deterrent for the soul to become a wanderer. Iron objects are also placed into the coffin or beneath it. A knife, a nail, or even a simple horseshoe will do, each carrying the same promise: you are protected. In some areas, a towel or length of cloth is laid in as well. And as the coffin is lowered, care is taken to keep it level and steady. A sudden drop, even by accident, is met with murmurs. It is a bad sign, a jolt that might wake what should stay at rest. The ropes are pulled up quickly, coiled neatly, and never allowed to be stepped over. To cross a rope that has touched the dead is to risk drawing some of their fate onto yourself. When the earth is shoveled back in, it is often done in layers. The first few shovelfuls come from the closest family, each one deliberate, the sound of soil on wood muffled by the snow. Then others take over, the rhythm building until the grave is filled. In older practice, the mound was sometimes shaped with a slight ridge, because it was thought the dead would press upward in their settling, and a higher mound would flatten naturally over time, rather than sink into a hollow. Evergreen branches might be placed over the mound once it's finished. Evergreen was chosen not only because it endures in winter, but because it was seen as a bridge between worlds, green in the land of frost, living in the place of dead. There is often one final gesture before the group turns to leave. It might be the lighting of a small candle, or it might be a whispered farewell, spoken so softly that only the cold air carries it away. It is meant to be a beacon for the soul on its first night in unfamiliar ground, to show that the living have done their part, and now the rest may begin. When the last tool is gathered and the path out of the cemetery is clear, people take care not to look back. Looking back was believed to invite the dead to follow. Boots press a new track into the snow, the sound of them fading until the cemetery silence takes over again. The first stop after the cemetery is not always home. More often, the mourners move together towards a single house, sometimes the home of the deceased, sometimes that of their close relative, where a table has already been set. The air inside is much warmer, carrying the smells of rye bread fresh from the oven, steaming bowls of barley or mushroom soup, and the faint tang of pickled vegetables waiting in their brine. This is the pominki, the funeral feast. It is as much a ritual as the burial itself, and like every ritual, each part has its reason. The first and most important is that a place is set for the one who's gone. A chair, a plate, and a cup was quietly set at the table. Sometimes it was filled, and sometimes it was empty. Though the spirit was told and taught not to return, it is a gesture that speaks to the belief that the spirit may still be near, and should be welcomed one last time if they wandered regardless. To deny a place would be to send the departed away abruptly, and that might linger in resentment for the spirit. The dishes served have their own symbolism. Bread, as always, is life and sustenance, and the salt is purity, a protection. Kutya, a sweet grain pudding made with honey and poppy seeds, is common. The honey is a wish for a sweet journey, and the poppy seeds a subtle nudge for the soul. Fish may appear on the table, its silver skin and movement through water tied to the idea of crossing into the other world. Drinks are poured not only for the guests, but for the absent one. A glass of vodka or horilka may be raised and tipped slightly towards the empty chair. In some households, a small amount is spilled onto the floor or into the fire, an offering to the unseen. A blend of farewell and blessing. It is a payment of sorts, a recognition that part of the meal belongs to those who cannot eat the way they used to. The conversation at the pominki is rarely heavy throughout. There are moments of silence, but also moments where laughter slips in, often in the form of stories about the departed. A shared joke about their habits, an affectionate grumble about their stubbornness. These are not seen as disrespect, but as binding threads in the tapestry of memory. The belief here is that remembering the dead as they truly were helps them stay settled. Music may follow, but never in the boisterous sense of a wedding, for example. Instead, a quiet song or the low hum of a familiar melody might drift around the table. These are not always funeral songs. Sometimes they are the tunes that the deceased enjoyed in life. Food is not only for the soul, and neither is music. It is for the living, too. The act of eating together after the burial knits the community back into its daily rhythm, reasserting that life continues. It's also practical. Grief dulls appetite, but hunger ignored makes the mind vulnerable to fear and dark thoughts. In some places, the pominki is repeated on the 9th and 40th days after death. The 9th day marks the soul's journey past the earthly realm, and the 40th is its arrival in the other world. Each of these gatherings mirrors the first, with food, toasts, the symbolic place at the table, and the light conversation. The repetition reinforces the bond between the living and the dead while steadily guiding the spirit away. When the guests begin to leave, they do so with small courtesies. A blessing at the door, a parting handshake, or a promise to visit soon. No one leaves in haste. Rushing out could suggest trying to outrun something. The last to leave may linger to help tidy, sweeping the crumbs carefully into the fire or outside the threshold. Even the crumbs carry meaning. They are the remains of a shared moment, and to throw them away carelessly would be to discard the entire ritual itself. By the time the house is quiet again, the table is cleared and the candles are burned low, the mood has shifted. The grief is still there, but is now given structure by meals and stories and song. The empty chair remains a little longer, until someone moves it back quietly to its usual place. Even after the grave has been filled and the pominki has been held, the work of guarding the dead continues. In Slavic tradition, burial is not the final step. The days following are a liminal stretch where the soul is in motion, and during this time, the village takes on small but deliberate measures to keep the separation intact. The first 3 days are considered the most delicate. It's believed that the soul is still lingering close by, so candles are kept burning in the home during this period to guide the spirit away without letting the darkness take hold. Light in these beliefs is a form of boundary. On the 9th day, the soul is thought to pass beyond the earthly realm. Until then, windows may be left slightly open during the day, allowing it to come and go without having to pass through doors. This custom of an open window stems from the idea that the air itself is a carrier. There are also protections meant specifically to discourage a return. A broom may be placed bristles up, and salt is sometimes sprinkled across windowsills and door frames, acting as a barrier and purifier. The family avoids certain behaviors during this time. No sweeping under the table, lest the soul be brushed away prematurely. No sewing, because the needle's piercing could bind the spirit into the home the way thread binds the fabric. And mirrors remain covered until the 40th day. The belief that the spirit might see itself would undo all the work. The 40th day is key. As it marks the soul's arrival in the other world, it allows them to take their place with the ancestors. Until then, the world is still tempting and within reach. And food continues to play a role in the watchfulness. Small portions are set aside from meals, sometimes placed on the windowsill or at the krasny ugol, the beautiful corner of the home where icons are kept. It's a tether of kindness, ensuring that if the soul visits in its lingering, it is fed and sent on its way content and happy. In rural areas, these offerings are also left at crossroads, a place believed to be busy with passing spirits, so that guides might be found for the traveler's final journey. Community vigilance is part of the custom. Neighbors check in during these days, sometimes under the guise of ordinary errands. A shared pot of soup, a visit to help with chores. These are acts of support, but they also give people a reason to notice if anything feels wrong in the house. A sudden chill, the lingering scent of soil where none should be, or a door found open. The cemetery, too, is not forgotten. On certain days, someone from the family will return to tidy the grave, clearing snow or placing fresh evergreen boughs. Tending the resting place reminds the soul that it is cared for. By the time the 40th day arrives, the household is ready to mark the transition. Another small feast is held, with the same symbolic place at the table for the departed, so now it is more of a send-off than a warm invitation. As prayers are said and candles are lit, the coverings are taken from the mirrors. The belief is that by now, the soul has found its place among the dead, and the home can open itself fully to the living once again. The protections are not discarded entirely. Garlic braids stay above doorways, and a pinch of salt is still kept in the corner of a windowsill, but they become part of the background, absorbed into the rhythms of daily life. For all the care taken in those 40 days, the mood shifts from vigilance to memory. What was once a guard against return becomes a quiet honoring of old connections. The customs that shape this long, gentle goodbye are not grand. They are slow and rooted, like hand-me-down shoes that walk the same path. They teach that memory is not a frozen monument, but a living gesture. A crumb on a windowsill, a whispered name, or a candle whose flame leans just slightly out of the door. Thank you for your time. Good night.